Hi, my name is Ainhoa Magrach, and today I'm going to tell you about the architecture of biodiversity. So, hi, my name is Ainhoa, and today I'm going to tell you a little bit about what biodiversity is and how we do research on biodiversity. So first, I wanted to try to define to you what we think of when we think of biodiversity. So in many instances, you've probably studied this at school, what biodiversity is, but many times we think of biodiversity as just species and the diversity of species. And we tend to think that one place is more diverse than another place just because it has a greater number of species. But the truth is that biodiversity has different components, and species diversity is just one of those components. So we also have genetic diversity, for example, which is a part of biodiversity. And the genetic diversity is the variety of genetic forms that we can have in a population or in a species. So here, for example, you have dogs, that's just one species, but all these different individuals, they have different genotypes, different genes, and that's why they look different. Same for the corn here, and same for the shells we have here. And why is it important to have genetic diversity? So I'm going to show you this with an example. So this is Chernobyl. You probably haven't heard of this, or maybe yes in the news, because this is in Ukraine, which is in the news now a lot, unfortunately. And in 1986, when you guys weren't even born, but I was a child, there was a huge accident in a nuclear plant in Chernobyl, and one of the reactors exploded, and so there was a lot of radiation that came from this nuclear plant. And so a lot of people died, and then they had to evacuate the area, and ever since then, no one has lived there. It's an area that people cannot go in there. And so I have a friend, his name is Germán Orizaola, and he's a professor at the University of Oviedo, and he works in this area, and he works with this species of frog. The species of frog is called Ila orientalis, and it's this green-colored frog. So what Germán and his colleagues have seen is that in the areas that are close to that reactor that exploded and where there's radiation, they found individuals of this species that are darker. They're not green, they're dark, they're even black. And why are they black? Well, they're black because they have a pigment called melanin, which is the same pigment that we have in our skins. So human populations that are exposed to solar radiation, they have more melanin in their skin, and that's why their skin is darker. And this melanin, it protects them from solar radiation. So it's good for them. But this melanin also protects against iodizing radiation, so against the radiation from the nuclear explosion. So individuals of this frog that are darker, that have more melanin, they are more protected from that radiation from the nuclear plant. And so what Germán and his colleagues have done is they've gone all over Ukraine, and they have studied populations of this frog all over the country in a gradient of distance from the area of radioactivity. So they've studied populations of frogs that are not exposed to radiation and populations of frogs that are exposed to the radiation. And what they have found is that those frogs that are closer to the area of radiation are darker, they're almost black. So what happens here, this is an example of rapid evolution, because this has happened in 10 generations of frogs that have occurred since 1986. And having this melanin is a genetic trait that is passed on to the different generations, and there's a variability in the population and in the species. And because of this variability, the species has been able to adapt to the new conditions of radiation, and it has been able to survive in these new conditions. So that's why having this diversity in the genes is important for survival. So another thing that's important when we talk about biodiversity is the diversity of functions that we have in an ecosystem, so functional diversity. And we have an example here with these two communities. So these are communities that you have in the intertidal area. So for example, if you go to Sopelana, to the beach, when the tide goes out, this is what you see, the types of communities you see here. And if we count the number of species that we have in these two communities, here we have 1 mussel and 3 species of barnacles, so we have 4 species. And in the side, we have the same mussel, we have a starfish, an anemone, and we have an aquatic plant. So we also have 4 species. So if we think of it just from the point of view of the number of species, these 2 communities would be equally diverse. But then if we look at the functions that these species perform in those ecosystems, then the picture is a bit different. On this side, both the mussel and the 3 barnacle species, they're all water filterers. They filter water and they eat the organic matter that's dissolved in that water. Whereas on the other side, we have the mussel, which is the water filter, but we have a starfish. And the starfish, they are predators. They eat other species like this fish here. Then we have the anemone, and the anemones, they have different functions. So remember Nemo, the film, Disney film, I'm sure you've all seen it. Well, Nemo, he lived in an anemone because that was its home. So they host fish, but they are also predators of other species. And then we have the aquatic plant. And the aquatic plant, it's a primary producer. It does the photosynthesis, and then it's food for other fish and other species that live in the water. And so now, if we look at it from the point of view of the functions, we see that actually this community is much more diverse than this one here. And so why is it important to have this functional diversity? Well, this is a picture of a forest, and the reason why we see the forest as we see it today, in this picture here, is because there's a lot of functions that are being performed simultaneously. So we have trees here, we have trees here, and the trees have leaves, and leaves fall to the ground. And the reason why we don't see just mountains of leaves and heaps of leaves is because there's insects and microorganisms that decompose all of that organic matter, and they make it available for other species to consume. Then we have in the soil, we have a lot of microorganisms and other insects that are involved in carbon cycles, nitrogen cycles that recycle all those nutrients. In the roots of many of these trees, we have fungi and algae that have a mutualistic relationship with these roots that form the mycorrhizae and that help the trees to fix nitrogen. Then we have the trees up here that are doing the photosynthesis, producing those leaves that are eaten by herbivores and produce fruits that are eaten by frugivores. And because we have all of these functions at the same time, we can see the forest as it is here. So what happens if we lose some of these functions? Well, depending on which functions we lose, the effects can be quite catastrophic. So an example of this, we can see it in another different kind of forest. This is a kelp forest. So kelp is an algae, and these kelp forests are found off the coasts of California, for example. And so you have groups of kelp algae that form this forest, and a lot of fish, they live here, they also reproduce here, so they're really important places for the diversity of fish and other animals that live in the oceans here. And for some time, researchers were seeing that areas that were previously covered by these kinds of kelp forests were being substituted by areas where there was absolutely no kelp, and yet you can only see sea urchins, so one species of sea urchin here. And they wondered, why was this happening? Why was the kelp forest disappearing and we only see these sea urchins? Well, they started to study the food webs in the area. And food webs are basically just diagrams that show who eats who in those ecosystems. So here you have the kelp, and kelp is consumed by the sea urchins. But what's interesting is that sea urchins only have one predator in that ecosystem, which are sea otters. And what was happening in this ecosystem is that sea otters were disappearing because they were being hunted, because they were being contaminated and polluted the waters, and they were killing them. There were shark attacks, and so a lot of the sea otter populations were disappearing. And what happens when those sea otters disappear is that sea urchins no longer have a predator, and so they increase in number very much. And as they increase in number, they consume a lot of the kelp, which disappears. And then with the disappearance of the kelp, we lose a lot of the other species that depended on that kelp forest to survive. So in this case, the sea otters were not only really cute animals, but also they're what we call keystone species in the ecosystem. They are species that if they disappear, there's a huge impact on the ecosystem. And This particular keystone species is a really cute one, but there are other keystone species that are not as cute. And an example of this, we can go to Yellowstone National Park in the United States. So here we're going to talk about wolves, and this is a super controversial topic because wolves, they eat sheep and livestock sometimes. So we have a very controversial relationship with this species. And what happened in Yellowstone Park for some time is that in the 1920s, they were killing all the wolves because they were eating the livestock. And so by the end of the 1920s, there wasn't a single wolf left in Yellowstone Park. And what the researchers started to see was that the park was starting to change once those wolves were removed from the ecosystem. So what happened there is that elk no longer had a predator, and so their numbers again increased very much. And they were eating a lot of the plants. Also, because there were no predators, they weren't afraid of anything. So they were just feeding in these open areas beside the rivers and eating all the vegetation that was beside those rivers. And the impact of that was that the rivers were no longer able to secure a lot of the water because there was no vegetation there. And so a lot of the fish were being lost from those rivers. A lot of the species like raptors and other birds that depended on the leftovers that wolves were leaving behind no longer had any food, and so they were also leaving the area. So when they saw this, many researchers, they said, okay, we should introduce the wolf back. And of course, there was a lot of controversy because a lot of people weren't happy with introducing the wolf again, but finally they were able to reintroduce it. And when they did that, again, the park changed completely. So the number of elk was reduced because they had a predator which was eating them, so herbivory in the area was reduced. Also, there was a landscape of fear now. The elk weren't just roaming around and eating anywhere they could. They weren't eating in these open areas because they were afraid of the wolf coming. And so the vegetation beside the rivers came back. A lot of the species of beavers, bears, many species came back because, again, the wolves were keystone species in the ecosystem, and they modified a lot of that ecosystem to make it better for other species. Okay, so now we've talked about species diversity, genetic diversity, functional diversity, but another form of diversity that is also super important is the diversity of interactions between the different species. So, for example, what do you see here? Does anyone want to go for? What do you think this is? You probably think it's a bicycle, right? It looks like a bicycle, but it's actually not a bicycle. It's just the parts of a bicycle. And if you want to have a bicycle, then you need to follow some instructions to build that bicycle. And if you do it the wrong way, then it doesn't really work as a bicycle, right? It's like IKEA furniture. You need to build it properly. Well, the same happens a little like with interactions in ecosystems. So in ecosystems, we have interactions between species that are not random. They have been modified by years and centuries and thousands of years of coevolution between different species. And these interactions are the building blocks of biodiversity and kind of the scaffolding system that keeps the system together. And in ecology, we love to study these kinds of interactions, and that's what I do. And a lot of the interactions that we have in ecosystems are, for example, what we call trophic interactions. And a trophic interaction is one where someone eats someone else. Things like this, which you see in the documentaries in Laude all the time. But there are other types of trophic interactions. So for example, herbivory is also a trophic interaction where you can see a caterpillar that's consuming this leaf here. And interactions can be way more complex than this. So, for example, this is Namibia, and these are formations that you can see in Namibia that for a long time have been called fairy circles. And people there, they didn't really know why there were circles like this in the landscape. And recently, they figured it out. So what happens here is that in the middle of these circles, there's termites. And termites, they consume the roots of the plants, and so no plants can grow in the middle. What happens then is when the rain comes down and the rain falls, it doesn't evapotranspirate through the plants. It goes down to the lower parts of the soil, and so it's available for the plants that are in the surrounding areas of the circle. So if you see it here, a little bit better. Termites here, they consume the plants. There's no plants here. Water falls, goes to the soil, and then these plants here, they have more water than the rest to grow taller. And then this serves as areas for many species to hide from other species, but then these areas, they also flower and they attract a lot of insects and a lot of other animals. So in this case, we have this rather complex interaction where we have these termites that are what we call ecosystem engineers because they are changing the ecosystem for other species. And these kinds of interactions are not limited to just one type of habitat. So they're not limited just to terrestrial habitats or to aquatic habitats, but there are interactions that move between habitat types. So for example, this is a study where they were looking at the impact or how fish in ponds impacted the production of seeds in plants in land, which sounds quite crazy, but it actually makes sense. So when you have fish in ponds, those fish, they consume the larvae of dragonflies. So dragonflies are these things here, and their larvae are aquatic. And so fish eat these aquatic larvae, and so the number of adult dragonflies that you have is decreased because of the fish. And dragonflies, they are predators of bees and other pollinators. So when you decrease the numbers of dragonflies, then you increase the number of pollinators because they are not being consumed by dragonflies, and pollinators pollinate the flowers and there's more seeds. So there's an effect of fish on plants, but it's mediated by this kind of complex interaction that moves between two different habitat types. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that we do in ecology is we study the impacts of human activity. So you've probably learned a lot about how we are changing the planet and how that is having a negative impact for biodiversity. We are in the 6th mass extinction and we're losing a lot of species. And so what we are witnessing at the moment is something that we call global change. And so global change are all the changes that the world is experiencing, especially since the half century of the 20th century, so since the 1950s in particular. And this is made of different impacts that we are doing to planet Earth. One of them is climate change, which I'm sure you've heard about, but the climate is changing, it's becoming warmer, precipitations are also changing, and this is affecting natural ecosystems. But we have other things. We have, for example, invasive species. I'm sure you've all seen this thing here, El Plumero. This comes from South Africa, I think, and it's invading all the areas here. And so invasive species, what they are is species that are outside of their normal range of distribution. They enter a new area and they have a negative impact there for the species that live in that new area. And also they lead to negative economic impacts. So for example, this study, they calculated that managing and the damage costs of these invasive species had a value of $1.3 billion at a global scale, which is quite a significant amount of money. Another thing that's part of global change is land use change. So we are changing a lot of the natural ecosystem. So places where there was forest, we're now changing them to agriculture. We build roads that fragment many of natural ecosystems, and in general, we are destroying a lot of those natural habitats. This is a map of the human footprint, so our cumulative impacts on the planet, which now amount to more than 75% of the planet has been impacted by human activities. And one of the greatest impacts is that of agriculture. So agriculture now covers more than 40% of the areas that are free of ice inland. But the impacts obviously are not only restricted to the land areas, they also affect the oceans. So we're seeing ocean acidification. So as the amount of CO2 increases in the atmosphere, the CO2 is being captured by the oceans, and this affects the carbon cycle there. It decreases the amount of calcium carbonate that's available in those oceans, and that's what the species that have shells, they use that calcium carbonate to make those shells. Species like corals, we're losing a lot of the corals because they don't have that calcium carbonate to make their shells. And all of these together are making this global change. So I want to give you an example of how one of these things, invasive species in this case, is affecting natural ecosystems through interactions between species. So what if I told you that this ant here is leading to an increase in the mortality of buffaloes in Kenya? You'd probably be like, that doesn't really make any sense because that's a really tiny animal and this is a really big animal, and how is this thing leading to increased mortality of buffaloes? Well, it's again a complex story. So in Kenya, we have these trees here. They're called whistling thorn trees. And these trees, they host this native species of ants. And they have a symbiotic relationship. So these trees, they make this domatia. These are like swollen parts of the tree. And the ants, they live inside those domatia. So the tree is giving them a home, but it also has nectaries that produce nectar, and the ants feed on that nectar. And in payment for those services, for home and food, the ants, they defend the tree from elephants. So when elephants try to attack these trees or break the trees, all of the ants get together and they start biting the elephant, and it's really painful. So the elephant leaves and doesn't attack the tree. So there's this cool symbiotic relationship between the ants and the trees, and because they attack the elephants when they try to attack the trees, then this minimizes the impact on the trees. But what happens is that this ant is an invasive species that comes from South Africa. And this ant, it kills this native ant, and it also consumes the larvae of this ant. So it's leading to the disappearance of this ant. And this ant does not protect the trees from the elephants. It doesn't have that kind of symbiotic relationship as the other one. And so what they are seeing is that elephants are destroying many more of these trees because they're no longer defended by those ants. And as a consequence, what they're seeing is that areas of savanna where you had more densely populated areas with these kinds of trees are now looking like this. So a lot of the trees are being lost because elephants are just destroying them all. And here comes the complex part. So this is the place where there's native ants, and here's the place where there's invasive ants. So here there's many trees, and here there aren't many trees. So in the area where there aren't many trees, zebras are able to see the lions. And so lions cannot attack the zebras because the zebras see the lion coming, and so they run. And the lions are still there, and they're still hungry. So what do? They go to buffaloes. And they go to the waterways and they feed on the buffaloes because they can no longer feed on the zebras because the zebras see them coming. So as you see, it's a rather complex relationship, but what we're seeing is that as the cover of the trees decreases, there's an increase in the death of buffaloes and a decrease in the death of zebras, which is really cool. And this made me think of this parable. This is an Indian parable where the story goes that there were several blind men who had never seen an elephant, and each of the blind men approaches the elephant from a different part. So one just goes to the trunk and says, "Oh, this is a snake," because it couldn't see anything. Then another one touches the leg and says, "Oh, that's a tree." And another one touches the tail and says, "No, that's a rope." So what this tells us is that when you only have a small picture of the whole, then you have a very biased picture. And so what's important is that you see the whole picture in order to understand everything. And that's what we also learn from that story with the ants and the buffaloes and everything. If you didn't study the whole story, you would think that ants are leading to an increase in mortality of buffaloes, which doesn't make much sense. So now I'm going to tell you more about what I work on specifically. I work on pollination, and I'm sure that you've learned at school what pollination is and what pollinators are. But pollination is the movement of pollen from the male parts of flowers to the styles, to the female parts of other flowers. And that's what plants need to do in order to reproduce because they cannot move. And a lot of plants, they can use the wind to disperse the pollen. So if anyone here is allergic to pollen, you probably know that the wind transports a lot of the pollen. But 85% of the plants with flowers, they depend on animals to move that pollen around. Animals like this cute bee here. And also 75% of the crops that we consume also depend on pollinators to some extent. But if I were to ask you all, for example, let's see what we know about pollination. If I were to ask you to think of a flower, a plant with flowers, and then now you're all thinking of a plant with flowers in your head, and then I were to kind of go through your brains and see what you each have in your brains, I would probably see something like this. You've each chosen a different species of plants because we're very aware of the diversity of plant species that exist. You can go to a flower shop and you have all these different flower species. But if we do the same exercise and I tell you now, okay, now think of your favorite pollinator species, or the pollinator that you think is more important, then the picture is very different. And if I looked through your brains, I would probably just see this. This is a honeybee. And when most people think of pollinators, they think of the honeybee. But the truth is, and thanks to this film, I hope you all know now, that there are more than 20,000 bee species in the planet. And the honeybee is just one of those 20,000 bee species. The Iberian Peninsula in particular is a hotspot of diversity of this group. So here we have more than 1,200 species of bees. And there's other things apart from bees that are also pollinators. So there's flies like this one's here. We have beetles, we have butterflies, hummingbirds. We have bats that also pollinate some flowers, moths, and we even have lizards that act as pollinators too. We work in Gorbea, and I'm sure you've all been there at least once, but just in this area in Gorbea where we've been working for the past 4 years, we've found more than 120 different species of pollinators that we've been working on. So in just a very tiny part of the world. And I'm sure that you've also been told at school that something is happening with the pollinators, that we're losing the pollinators, and that if we lose the bees, we're all going to die. So what's happening exactly with the bees? So I'm going to tell you a little bit what happens with climate change and pollinators. So climate change is affecting the distribution, so where they are present, of both plants and pollinators. And for example, this is a study that was done in the Alps, and they had data on the distribution in elevation of both plant species and their pollinator species. And they compared the data that they had from 1800s to the data of today. And what they found was that both the plants and the pollinators, they were going to higher elevations, as those higher elevations were becoming warmer with climate change. But what they found is that plant species were moving faster than pollinator species. So potentially at one point, the plant species will reach an elevation where they don't have any pollinators to pollinate them. Another thing that we're seeing is that climate change is also affecting the phenology, both of the pollinator and of the plant species. And the phenology, for example, is when the plant species are flowering. So this is, for example, a graph that shows when cherry trees in Japan, when they blossom, when they have the flowers. And they have data from the year 800, which is quite an impressive data set. And what they've found is that the cherry trees, they are blossoming earlier and earlier every year. So they used to bloom in April, for example, now they're blooming in March. And what happens there is that the blooming of plants is determined by temperature. So once the adequate temperature is reached, then they produce their flowers. But in the case of pollinators, they do not appear just with temperatures. There's other factors that affect when they are coming out. And so at one point, we also might see that the plants are flowering and there are no pollinators there to pollinate them. Another thing that we're seeing is that the climate change is leading to changes in the morphology of both the plant and the pollinator species. So, for example, this is a study that was done in the Rocky Mountains in the United States. And what they found is that bees there, the bumblebees, they are becoming smaller. And as they become smaller, their tongues are also becoming smaller. And why are tongues important? Well, the length of the tongue of a pollinator determines the plant species it can visit. So sometimes the nectar is hidden, and if you don't have a long tongue, then you cannot reach that. So what's happening there is that as the tongues are becoming smaller, there are some plant species that they can no longer visit. And so from the plant's perspective, that's really bad. And finally, what we are also seeing is that climate change is both affecting the behavior of pollinator species, but also the attractiveness of plant species. So plant species in their flowers, they have a series of volatile compounds. So this is the chemistry of the flowers, and the combination of those volatile compounds are the ones that give them their smell. So with climate change and with the increase in temperatures, we're seeing changes in the composition of those volatile compounds. So basically the smell of the flowers is changing. And as you yourselves are probably attracted to some flowers because you like their smell, the same happens with pollinators. And as the smell is changing, they're also changing the flowers that they like. As I told you before, it's not just climate change out there, there's other impacts. In the case of pollinators, we also have the impact of honeybee keeping. So honeybees, although they also are exposed to different illnesses and have different problems, they have beekeepers that take care of them, that have antibiotics to take care of them. And so the number of honeybee hives has increased in the past years. And as a consequence of that increase in the number of honeybees, what we're seeing is that the number of wild bees that we see is decreasing because they are being substituted by these honeybees. We are seeing how natural ecosystems are becoming more homogeneous with just one species. Another thing that's really impacting pollinators out there is agriculture, and specifically the intensification of agriculture. So as we see more areas of agriculture that just have one monoculture and where there are no flower margins, no hedgerows, nothing in the landscape to provide flowers for those pollinators, we're seeing a lot of declines of pollinator populations, particularly in these agricultural landscapes. And when I give these kinds of talks where I really am talking about all the negative impacts of all our activities on biodiversity, I always like to end with a positive note. So although we are seeing a lot of impacts on pollinators and wild pollinators specifically, at least in the Iberian Peninsula, we're not seeing any species extinctions. So we're seeing declines in populations, but these populations are maintained in different places. And so there's still things that we can do in order to reverse this trend and to bring back biodiversity. And for example, there's a number of things that we can do in our gardens, in different places to attract and to give areas for these pollinators to live. So we can just not mow our grass that much and keep flowers that are food for these pollinators. We can also provide them nests. I'm sure you've seen these kinds of nests where they put their eggs inside or leave them bare ground so they can nest on the ground. And yeah, that's it for me. Thank you very much.
So now it's time for questions. No questions at all?
It was super clear.
So, any doubt? No? So I will have to ask something, just to start. You said something about aromas,
Yes.
which are changing. So that means that the aroma are different from the different flowers, or the change in intensity of the aroma is changing, or what else?
The composition of those volatile compounds, and the composition is what makes
So the aroma is different, really. So clavel is not clavel now, or rosa is not rose. Something like that?
Yeah, something like that. The smell of many different, not of all the flowers, but of many different
Some of
flowers,
them.
it's changing. Also because the nectar in the flowers of many species, they have yeasts. So like we have for beer or for things like that, we have yeasts in the nectar that are consuming some of the sugars in the nectar and that also change the composition of those volatile compounds. And those yeasts are also being affected by the warming. And so that interaction is also being changed.
Mm-hmm. Any other question? Yes?
Wait.
Wait a minute.
How many pollinators, apart from bees, have been as important and relevant as bees nowadays?
Yeah, so for example, in our studies in Gorbea, we find a lot of bees but from those 120 pollinator species that we have, a lot of flies. So in Gorbea, for example, flies are more important than bees as pollinators. And then if you go to different places, so for example, if you go to the Americas where you have hummingbirds, hummingbirds are super important for many flowers there. And there's flowers that have co-evolved with those hummingbirds, and only hummingbirds can visit those flowers. So yeah, depending on the ecosystem, different species are more important.
Any other questions? You talked something about wolves, which are really a problem now in some parts of Bizkaia. So do you think there is a way to control the number of wolves, just trying to avoid killing sheep?
Yeah, that is a problem, and of course, if you have sheep, that's a problem. The number of wolves is very low at the moment, and the number of sheep that they kill is also very low. And when you have a sheep that's killed, you get money from the government.
Yeah.
In other countries, it's different. So, for example, in Sweden, the farmers or the people that own the land, they are paid for each wolf that they are able to maintain in their landscape, instead of by each sheep that they get killed. So it's more of a conservation approach. Here it's a kind of, let's pay for the damage, but we don't like the species. The press is different.
Yeah, it depends on the country and the needs they have.
Yeah.
Now, time to ask.
So, as you said, the flowers have a scent or aroma, so the bees enjoy some flowers more than others. So, my question is, could the aroma of flowers be artificially modified so the bees and pollinators could go more often for the plants?
Yes, that's a great question. Actually, yes, and some people are doing research on that, specifically on the thing that I said about yeasts. So not only the scent, but the presence of yeasts, they kind of are able to know that there's yeasts there, and these yeasts, they live in places that have a lot of sugar. And so for the pollinator to know that there's yeasts there, it means that there's sugar there, and so they go there. And so there's some researchers that are working on inoculating yeasts to flowers to increase the number of visits, and they find that it works. It's just a lot of work because you have to. So now they are going with a pipette, just putting yeast into flowers. So I guess once they are able to do that more automatically, maybe with drones or something, then it will work. But yeah, definitely. Yeasts, levaduras.
So thank you, Ainhoa. It has been a pleasure to listen to your talk. Thank you.